Houston's boots pressed against the grated floor, the metal thrumming beneath him with the steady vibrations of the USS Lockridge slicing through open sea. A floating fortress, a classified ghost ship. Its mission? To carry things that had no business being real. The cargo hold wasn't filled with nuclear weapons. No stolen technology, no enemy prisoners. Instead, monsters. The kind you heard as a child. Folklore, legends, fairy tales, ancient sea creatures that once roamed the Earth's oceans. The ones the government had been catching for decades. Things that people whispered about in rural bars. Their accounts dismissed as drunken nonsense. Things that shouldn't exist, but did. Cryptids. The Lockridge carried Bigfoots, though the ones in containment didn't resemble the legends. They weren't just oversized apes. They had human-like intelligence, unnatural jaws filled with giant blocked teeth, and a smell so rancid it burned the nostrils. The ship carried creatures called Rakes, their sunken, lidless, black eyes gleaming from within their glass prisons. Bent back, tall, lanky creatures, their claws too long for their bodies, their pale skin stretched so tight over bone that it looked as though they'd been skinned alive. No one knew the origins of these abominations, possibly some military experiment gone wrong. Then there were the Skinwalkers. Caleb hated them the most. Not because they were utterly horrifying and grotesque looking. Not because they were strong. Not because they were fast. But because they just simply shouldn't exist. The scientists on board didn't know what they were. All they knew is that they were cursed and used some sort of dark magic to shapeshift into any animal or creature. Maybe they had once been human. Maybe they weren't. They wore people's skin if they wanted to mimic a diseased person. Wear them like clothes, not like a disguise. They actually became them. A skinwalker could copy a man's voice, his gait, a woman's scream, a child's laugh, even his little habits. It was almost perfect. Almost, but there was always something disturbingly off. The way they held their head too still, the way their lips moved a second too late after speaking, the way they stood in their containment cells for hours without shifting and just watching. The Lockridge had 3 of them. That was 3 too many. Then there were the Dogmen. They resembled a 7-foot-tall werewolf creature, like the ones you would see in horror movies. Some of them even grew to 13 feet. These things weren't under some supernatural curse. They didn't transform. It was their true form. They had giant dog-like heads with long, pointy ears, and they walked like men. Some had matted fur, and some had sleek fur. They had hands, not paws, but their fingers ended in thick, hooked claws capable of cutting through flesh and bone like soft butter. The damage these Dogmen could inflict on a human being is unfathomable. Caleb had spent enough time in Containment Block D to know that these things never spoke. He knew these things were extremely intelligent, just the way they watched him and the other guards patrol. It's like they were studying, looking for weaknesses, looking for a way out. That thought unsettled him as he continued his rounds, rifle pressed against his shoulder. The ship groaned, the sound reverberating through the bulkheads like a wounded animal. He passed Containment Block B. The Bigfoots were quiet, probably sedated. He passed Block C. The Skinwalkers were locked up. Good. Then he reached Block D. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Not the usual musk of fur and damp rot, something far fouler, like a dead roadkill carcass left out in the sun too long. His pulse ticked up. His rifle came up. The security door was open. It was impossible. Those doors required 2 security personnel, a keycard, and a manual override code. There was no reason for it to be unlocked. He stopped and stared. A low, rumbling growl echoed from within. He reached for his radio. "Security. We have a breach in Block D." His voice was even, but his grip on the rifle tightened. Static, then a voice. "Copy that, Caleb. What's the situation?" He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, the radio exploded with sound. A shriek scream, cut off mid-sentence, a sharp crunch, like ribs being torn apart, then silence. The hair on the back of his neck rose. Caleb stepped back, scanning the corridor. The ship hummed, empty and cavernous. Somewhere, water sloshed against the hull, a reminder that they were alone, miles from any coast. No help, no backup, just the Lockridge and its cargo. A faint, clicking sound came from above, not from the corridor, but from the vents. His fingers went stiff around the trigger as he tilted his head upward. The ventilation grates ran along the ceiling, narrow and rusted in places, wide enough for a man. But these weren't men. A pair of glowing yellow eyes locked onto his from the darkness. Before he could react, the metal buckled outward. Something huge crashed down. Caleb jerked back, rifle snapping up as the creature landed in a crouch. It was bigger than the others he'd seen, nearly 7 feet tall. Long, thin, and ripped torso. Its spine hunched in a way that made it look too long, its fingers dragging against the grated floor. Its fur was patchy, black in some places, mottled gray in others. Its mouth hung slightly open, revealing rows of jagged teeth, each one too sharp to belong in something that wasn't a shark. It breathed in. Caleb knew what that meant. It had his scent. The moment his finger pressed against the trigger, the thing moved. Fast. Faster than something that size should be able to. His first 3 shots hit it in the chest, dark blood spraying across the floor. The 4th went wide as the Dogman lunged, claws swiping through the air where his head had been a second earlier. Caleb threw himself back, hitting the floor hard as the thing landed where he'd just been standing. It snarled, shoulders rolling unnaturally as it turned to face him again. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, intelligent, calculating, the same way a wolf studies a wounded animal before going in for the kill. Caleb scrambled to his feet. The sound of scraping metal came from behind him. More claws, more eyes. His stomach twisted. There was more than one who escaped. The air ducts above groaned as something crawled through them, the sound of heavy breathing echoing in the tight space. A sharp, metallic clang. The vents collapsed inward. A second Dogman dropped onto the floor behind him, this one smaller, about 6 feet tall, but still terrifyingly intimidating. Caleb's heart almost popped out of his chest from the adrenaline and fear. He was boxed in. The first Dogman shifted on its feet, shoulders tense. The second took a step forward, golden eyes flicking between Caleb and its wounded packmate. It was deciding. Caleb made the choice for it. He fired a burst at the wounded one. The Dogman let out a snarl, staggering just enough. Caleb bolted. His boots pounded against the floor as he sprinted down the corridor. The things behind him let out a rattling howl, and then he heard it. The thunderous gallop of claws hitting metal. They were chasing him with no hesitation, no pause, full sprint, hatred in their eyes, and they were gaining quickly. Caleb wasn't going to make it to the security hub, Mott, without getting torn apart. His eyes darted to the side, a maintenance hatch. Not ideal, but better than being ripped to shreds. He threw himself into it, slamming the panel shut behind him just as claws scraped against the metal. The Dogmen slammed into the door, the force of their impact rattling the entire frame. Caleb didn't breathe, didn't move. They were right there, waiting for him like a cat waiting for a mouse to come out of. And they weren't going away. The door behind Caleb shuddered as the Dogman slammed against it. claws raked metal, leaving deep gouges in the surface. He knew they wouldn't stop until they broke through and got him. He took a breath, pushed forward. The maintenance crawl space was narrow, barely wide enough for his shoulders. Pipes ran along both sides, sweating condensation in the dim emergency lighting. The air smelled like rust and seawater. His radio crackled. "Caleb, what's your status?" "Over." It was Harrison, one of the few security guys he trusted. He pressed the transmitter. "Dogmen are out. Block D is compromised." A pause. Then, "How bad?" Caleb wiped the sweat from his forehead, swallowing the answer he wanted to say. "Bad." Another silence. Then Harrison spoke, voice grim. "Meet us at the armory. We're locking it down." The armory, if they had any chance of surviving, it was there. But Caleb was deep in the ship's maintenance corridors. The Lockridge was a massive vessel, and the armory was at least 3 decks up past multiple containment sectors. He wasn't alone in here. Something moved in the vents above him, a slow, deliberate dragging sound. Not a Dogman, something else. A clicking voice whispered his name.
"Caleb."
His chest tightened. Fear shot through his body. Skinwalkers. He had no time to deal with them. He pushed forward, rifle tight in his grip, crawling as fast as he could. The ship was a labyrinth, full of twisting maintenance tunnels and dead ends. Somewhere ahead, he heard screaming and gunfire. He wasn't the only one running for his life. Caleb dropped out of the maintenance tunnel into a blood-slicked hallway, almost slipping and landing face first onto the floor. The lights flickered, some shattered, their exposed wiring hissing and sparking. A security officer was sprawled against the wall, his throat ripped open. A few feet away, another man twitched on the floor. Not dead yet, his hands clutched his stomach, trying to keep his intestines from spilling out. Caleb knelt down beside him. He was one of the young cooks on the ship, couldn't have been older than 25. Caleb tried to press his hand down on his stomach from keeping his guts from spilling out even more. The young man started convulsing and twitching, going into shock. "Hey, kid," Caleb whispered, smacking him a few times on his cheek before his body went limp, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. He was gone. Caleb moved past him. There was nothing he could do for him anymore. More gunfire erupted ahead. Controlled bursts, not panic fire. Survivors. Caleb sprinted, boots slamming against the metal deck. As he rounded the next corner, he almost ran straight into another guard. Private Nolan, wide-eyed, rifle shaking. Blood smeared across his uniform. The kid nearly pulled the trigger before realizing it was Caleb. "Jesus Christ, Caleb, you're alive." Barely. Caleb pushed past him, scanning the corridor. 2 more men were crouched near the bulkhead. Harrison was one of them. Caleb's gut sank. "Where's the rest of the team?" Harrison didn't answer. Nolan's hands clenched around his rifle. "We had 9 guys with us an hour ago." He didn't have to say the rest. There were 4 of them now. Something thudded against the walls, close, heavy claws scraping. Caleb raised his rifle. "We need to keep moving, guys." They pushed forward, sticking to the tightest corridors where the creatures couldn't maneuver easily. They passed more bodies, security, engineers, some torn apart, ribs cracked open like butchered cattle. Others missing entirely, only their blood and bits of clothing left behind. The Lockridge had become a graveyard and floating buffet in the middle of the ocean. The ship groaned as they stepped onto the outer catwalks, narrow steel platforms lining the Lockridge's massive interior cargo bay. Below, the industrial floodlights flickered against the reinforced containment cells. The holding pens for the Bigfoots and Rakes were open, the cages empty. All the remaining guards could do in that moment was pause for a moment, a deep feeling of fear. They weren't just dealing with Dogmen. The entire cargo hold was compromised. This has to have been an inside job, Caleb gestured. These containment units can't be pried open from the inside unless we missed something. Either way, it didn't matter. Staying alive and getting help is what mattered. All of a sudden, something stirred in the darkness below. A low growl carried through the metal framework. The four men moved faster. Nolan stumbled, catching himself on the rail, his breathing heavy. Something massive crashed onto the walkway behind them. Caleb turned, just in time to see a Dogman land on all fours, its claws curling into the metal. Its golden eyes burned in the dark, and it wasn't alone. Two more crawled over the catwalk's edge. Nolan opened fire. A burst of bullets tore through the first Dogman's chest. It staggered back a few feet before lunging. Its claws punched through Nolan's stomach, a burst of blood squirting everywhere. Caleb grabbed the kid by the vest, yanking him back, but the Dogman ripped him in half. His screams cut off instantly. Caleb stumbled back, gun roaring as he emptied his magazine into the monster. The Dogman stumbled, its blood splattering against the walls. Harrison grabbed him. They ran. Behind them, the Dogman howled. More were coming. By the time they reached the security armory, both men were out of breath. The three remaining guards pounded on the bulkhead door. Open the damn hatch. The reinforced door slid open, and they dove inside just as something slammed into it. The security lock clamped down. Caleb collapsed against the wall, his entire body shaking. Harrison bent over, hands on his knees. The room was filled with other survivors. 8 men, all armed, bloodied, exhausted, terrified. The armory was one of the only fortified locations on the ship. They were safe, for now. One of the senior officers, Sergeant Wallace, stood at the center of the room, his face grim and blank. He nodded to Caleb. "You made it." Caleb looked around. Not many had. Wallace crossed his arms. "We've got a decision to make." He gestured to the racks of weapons behind him. Shotguns, automatic rifles, grenades. All that was left of their arsenal. "The Lockridge belongs to us," he said, "and I say we take it back." A silence settled over the room. No one spoke. Caleb's teeth clenched, his fingers tightening on his rifle. "Count me in." A few of the others nodded. The decision was made. Caleb glanced at the door. The Dogmen and other cryptids were still out there, and they were waiting to slaughter the humans that captured and put them aboard that ship. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe to Descent into the Unknown for more horror content. If you have any real cryptid encounters, or you're a horror writer wanting to share your stories, please feel free to email me in the description anytime.